In Brad Snyder's new book on Felix Frankfurter, the cover notes report, quote, the conventional wisdom about Felix Frankfurter, former Harvard law professor and Supreme Court justice, is that he struggled to fill the seat once held by Oliver Wendell Holmes. Professor Snyder's biography notes that scholars have portrayed Frankfurter as a judicial failure, a liberal lawyer turned conservative justice, and the Warren Court's principal villain. And yet none of these characterizations ring true. Georgetown professor Brad Snyder uses 700 pages to examine Justice Frankfurter's life. Brad Snyder, in your new book on Felix Frankfurter, there was a note about notes that surprised me, and you say that he wrote 300 notes or letters to FDR from the court during his time on the court. How did you find that? And that seems to be an unusual thing.
Yeah, and Brian, thanks for having me on your show. I can't really document all of that, right? Like, I found a lot of notes between Frankfurter and FDR at the FDR library that came out of Max Friedman's book on Roosevelt and Frankfurter, and Friedman had exclusive access both to Frankfurter in the form of interviews, which I used and transcribed, and also he had total access to Frankfurter's papers before anyone else did. And so that's what Friedman says. It could be an exaggeration, but even if you look at the published dialogue back and forth between Frankfurter and Roosevelt, and then the additional documents in the FDR library, it's an enormous amount.
What does it mean, do you think, about him, and for that matter, about FDR?
What it means about him is that Americanism was his religion, and politics was sort of what really drove him. Ever since he was a boy who, came to this country at age 11, not speaking a word of English, and then, a couple of years later, he's, determined just to get a glimpse of William Jennings Bryan, on a train platform in Hoboken, right? He's obsessed with American politics. And, it's just an amazing American story when somebody can come to this country at 11, not speaking a word of English, and by 26, they're friends with Theodore Roosevelt, right? He just had a lot of policy expertise. And Franklin Roosevelt, what it says about Franklin Roosevelt was he knew he wasn't the smartest person in the room and surrounded himself with lots of smart people and took advice from lots of people. And one of those principal advisors was Felix Frankfurter on the outside, right? I thought and they had a long friendship, right? It goes all the way back to World War I, and it rekindles when Roosevelt was governor of New York. And Frankfurter realized in 1928, before many people, including his friend Walter Lippmann did, that Franklin Roosevelt, when he won that election in 1928, he squeaked it out, right? He won the New York governorship, and Al Smith got trounced for the presidency, who was the former governor of New York. Frankfurter realized that Franklin Roosevelt was the future of the Democratic Party, and that the Democratic Party was going to be the liberal party in this country. And none of those things was obvious in 1928.
As you say, he served on the Supreme Court from 1939 to 1962. But you open the book with a very interesting story about JFK. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. I open the book after Frankfurter has left the court, but not before he's retired. He suffers a stroke in April of 1962 and spends a long time in the hospital recuperating. And Frankfurter is a total extrovert and a people person, and he talks to all the doctors, all the nurses, all of the orderlies about what they think about President Kennedy and his policies and the administration and how the country is going. And they like President Kennedy, but they're not really sure what Kennedy's policies are. And so Frankfurter wants to meet with the president, and he has a number of former students and law clerks who are working with the president. And Kennedy comes to Frankfurter's house when he's in this recuperation process at home, and for several hours talks to Frankfurter about what Frankfurter has learned while in GW Hospital. And the relationship between the Kennedys and Frankfurter goes way back. It's very complicated. When Jack Kennedy was just a boy, his father, Joe, asked Frankfurter, what should I do with my son's education? And Frankfurter had both Joe Jr. and Jack study with his friend Harold Lasky, who was a socialist, at the London School of Economics. And now Joe Jr. loved studying with Harold Lasky. Jack not so much, and sort of left early and pleaded health problems. But still, that relationship between the Kennedys and Frankfurter goes way back, even though Frankfurter hated the old man. He hated Joe Kennedy. Joe Kennedy was spreading a lot of anti-Semitic lies about Frankfurter during the Roosevelt administration, after Joe Kennedy had been fired as the ambassador to Great Britain, or at least relieved of his duties. Let's put it that way. So it's a complex history, and Frankfurter was not a huge JFK fan, but as I said, Americanism was his religion, and he wanted JFK to succeed. And so JFK came to his house. And that's just an amazing thing for an American president to come to a private citizen's house to kind of get policy advice. And what it shows, at least from Frankfurter's perspective, is just how much of a track record he has in advising American presidents, again, going all the way back to former President Theodore Roosevelt.
Describe Frankfurter on a personal basis.
Little, right? He's small. He is very excitable. He also can be didactic, right? But he's super intense. But he also loves meeting interesting people, men, women, loved children. And he's just a live wire is, I think, the best way I would describe it. When he gets really excited about talking to you, Brian, he grabs your forearm and squeezes it. It was a famous move of his, this forearm squeeze, and I found a picture of Frankfurter squeezing somebody's arm during a conversation, and I knew I had to get it in the book because it just showed how animated he could be in conversation. He was super passionate. I think the adjective I would use most about him is passionate.
Why did his father come to the United States in the first place from Austria?
His father was kind of the black sheep of the family. Frankfurter, both on his mother's side and his father's side, in Austria, had a fairly distinguished family. His uncle was a very prominent librarian at the University of Vienna, philologist, and Frankfurter even lived with his uncle in Austria for a time. But his father was someone who could never really make good. He was by some accounts, he was a traveling salesman when he was in Vienna, and in other accounts, he was a peddler, but he never really could make money. At one point, he moved the family to Budapest to try to make money. And I think he came to America, as most people came to America, or a lot of people came, looking for a fresh start, right? And Frankfurter's father wrote the family back home. He said, you won't be used as cannon fodder in this country, right? He went to the World's Fair in Chicago, and he was sort of his father did, and he was just amazed. This is in the 1890s, and said, America, anything's possible in this country. And so he came to America, and he continued to struggle financially, but obviously one of his children ascended to just great heights.
Where did Felix Frankfurter move to when he came to the States when he was 11? Where did he go to school, and where did he end up teaching?
So, this is super interesting, Brian. Frankfurter's family, by virtue of being from Austria and not Eastern Europe, did not grow up on the Lower East Side or in Brooklyn. He grew up just a little north of the Lower East Side in Lower Manhattan in a German-speaking neighborhood that was sort of a lower middle class neighborhood, and had a lot of access to books and libraries, and really lived at Cooper Union, reading the newspapers at Cooper Union. But I think the most formative experience of his young life was when he came to this country not speaking any English. He had a teacher named Miss Hogan in PS 25 who threatened the other students, most of whom were German-speaking, with corporal punishment, back when that was allowed, that they would be hit if any of the students spoke to Frankfurter in German. And so they didn't, and Frankfurter was forced to learn English, and he quickly thrived, and he entered for high school City College of New York into a combined high school college program and graduated third in his class at age 19. A couple of years later, he took a year to work in New York City. He goes to Harvard Law School, and he finishes first in his class. And even though he had finished first in his class, Wall Street law firms discriminated against Jews at that time. It was very hard for him to find a job. He finally found a job with a Wall Street law firm, and he leaves it after 3 months because he gets a call from the U.S. attorney in Lower Manhattan named Henry Stimson, and he asked Frankfurter to come to work for him, and Frankfurter did. And that really started Frankfurter on this path of public service. And he saw that as the greatest thing you could do is serve your country and government. And when he becomes a professor at Harvard Law School in 1914, his gospel to his students is not to go make money at firms on Wall Street or in Boston or in Chicago or in Washington, but to serve their country in the federal government. And he became this sort of placement agent, if you will, talent scout for all of these administrations, starting in the teens and going all the way through FDR when they started calling his students the happy hot dogs, right, all the way up to John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson's administrations. It was quite amazing.
It's hard to find audio video on him, but we did find some, and I want to just run a 45, maybe it's a 30-second clip, so you can hear what he sounds like. And this was back in 1946, Felix Frankfurter.
The unfolding of our republic is the story of the greatest racial admixture in history. Of the 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence, 18 were of non-English stock. Foreign-born citizens from almost every land fought in the war for independence, helped to save the Union, and in conspicuous numbers are found on the honor rolls of the 2 world wars.
What are you hearing there?
You hear somebody who is just a 100% American patriot, right? Somebody who, loved his country, loved its history more than anything else. Was that on what was called I Am an American Day? Was that what that speech was? Was that one near the Washington Monument?
No, he also appeared with John Harlan Stone, the Chief Justice at the time. I believe it was the Chief Justice at the time.
Well, Harlan Stone was the Chief Justice then. That's totally correct.
Yeah, they were sitting side by side. I mean, it was really hard to find it.
Wow. I mean, you're hearing somebody who just believes that America is the greatest country in the world and where anything is possible. I mean, that's his life story, right? You started with Roosevelt. One of the problems with Frankfurter's 300 letters to Roosevelt when he's on the court with Harlan Stone is he can't stop being that sort of policymaker and advisor to presidents when he's on the court. So he's really, by day he's a Supreme Court justice, and at night he's a presidential policymaker, and that got him into trouble, Brian. And I think that compromised his abilities as a justice in some ways in a couple of pivotal cases during the Roosevelt years.
How often did you find him when he was on the court that he went to the White House and had personal conversations with FDR?
A lot. And, what's incredible is, those are publicly available information. They're text searchable. Certainly before he was on the court, in 1935, he was there all summer long to help Roosevelt pass his second New Deal. And that's, of course, 4 years before he was on the court. But what's crazy is those logs, Brian. Once Frankfurter gets on the court, he's left off a lot of those logs, right? So it's not super comprehensive. So we don't know how often he was at the White House after he became a justice. But he and Roosevelt or in close contact. I think more important, Brian, than how many times he visited the White House was just how often he was advising Henry Stimson, who was, again, that U.S. attorney in the Southern District, who Frankfurter had persuaded FDR while he was on the court. He persuades FDR to make Henry Stimson Secretary of War, because Stimson had been Secretary of War under William Howard Taft, and Frankfurter knew that the United States' entry into World War II was inevitable, and they needed somebody who was really good to run the War Department. So Frankfurter was constantly advising Henry Stimson, and Henry Stimson's chief assistant, John McCloy, was a former student of Frankfurter's on wartime policy. And again, that got him into a lot of trouble because the Supreme Court's hearing a lot of cases, such as about Nazi saboteurs or Japanese internment, and Frankfurter was really compromised in those kind of cases.
I got on the list, and you write about these folks in your book, but I got on the list of all the clerks he had online. And just to quick name some, those who are at least my age would recognize a lot of these names. Joseph Rao, the former publisher of the Washington Post, Philip Graham. These are clerks to him when he was on the court. William Coleman, who was Secretary of Transportation in the Republican administration. Elliot Richardson was the Attorney General. Abram Shays. E. Barrett Prettyman, if you come to Washington on the courthouse downtown, his name's on the front of it. And then Doris Kearns Goodwin's husband, Richard Goodwin. I assume there are others, but how did he get all these people there? And were you ever surprised to learn what they ended up doing in their lives?
Well, not if you knew Frankfurter. I mean, those first few names, right? Joseph Rao and Phil Graham were his students at Harvard, and so he knew them well. So initially, he's getting his own students, and later on, when you get to William T. Coleman, who, by the way, was the first African American Supreme Court clerk. This is 1948, right? A year after Jackie Robinson broke baseball's color barrier. This was front page news. But of course, Frankfurter, as he wrote everyone, didn't care what color Bill Coleman was. What he cared about was Bill Coleman was first in his Harvard Law School class and was really good friends with his co-clerk, Elliot Richardson. But I think, Frankfurter had inculcated top students at Harvard Law School with this spirit that the best thing you could do with your life was public service. And Harvard was so dominant, right, as a law school, right? There was it was so much far ahead of other law schools, right? Yale was catching up, right, in the 50s and 60s, but Harvard was really a dominant law school at that time and attracted an enormous amount of talented students who aspired to go into public service. And Frankfurter wanted law clerks who would go into public service. And when Frankfurter had them in his chambers, he was telling them his stories of public service and introducing them to public servants who would be in Frankfurter's chambers. Frankfurter's chambers was described by Joseph Rao as Felix's barbershop because there was a nonstop cavalcade of people in public life who arrived at his chambers. Frankfurter's best friend and former student was a former Secretary of State under Truman. I'm blanking at the moment. I'll get it in a second.
Landis? Was it Landis?
No, it's not. It's not. Dean Acheson, right? Dean Acheson and is the lawyer who represents Frankfurter's confirmation hearing and then goes on to become Truman's Secretary of State. They walk to work at least part of the way almost every day from their homes in Georgetown. Usually they would stop at Acheson's office. Either when Acheson was in the State Department, they'd walk to the State Department, or when Acheson was a lawyer at Covington and Burling, they'd stop at Covington and Burling, and someone would pick Frankfurter up from that point.
By the way, what would the reaction be today if you had a justice that was this close to the White House?
Well, there would be a huge outcry. Can you imagine one of the justices going in the back door of the White House and advising the president on political policies? There would be a tremendous outcry. It just isn't done now, right? It just isn't done now, and it's it couldn't happen. If it did happen, I think you'd have calls for impeachment. And the problem is, I'm not excusing what Frankfurter did because it wasn't right, but there was a long history of it going on all the way back to Justice Brandeis advising Woodrow Wilson. There's just a long history of justices, including some of Frankfurter's colleagues on the court. William O. Douglas and Robert Jackson and Hugo Black and Frank Murphy were all kind of had Roosevelt's ears in certain ways, but I think you could argue that Frankfurter took that kind of White House or executive branch policy making while he was on the court to an extreme, and sort of to his detriment.
I want to go to chapter 28 because it's an interesting story that you talk about the retirement of Owen Roberts from the court. And I know this is out of context with your very long book, but can you give us the background on what happened as Owen Roberts was retiring?
Sure. Let me just give you a little bit of background about Owen Roberts because I'm super interested in him. Owen Roberts was sort of a second choice for a Supreme Court justice seat. The first person, John Parker of North Carolina, was so opposed by liberals, particularly by labor unions and African Americans, that the NAACP, for the first time in its history, testified against the nominee, and the Senate voted Parker down, and Roberts was seen as a second choice and was sort of hailed by liberals once he got on the court. Well, the problem was that in 1935 and 1936, Roberts was siding with conservatives to strike down Roosevelt's New Deal programs. Roosevelt threatened to pack the court with his court-packing plan, and even though Roberts had made some of his votes before Roosevelt's announcement, Roberts moderated his views and began upholding Roosevelt's New Deal programs, as well as state minimum wage laws, and so avoided kind of a catastrophe with which people called at the time the switch in time that saved nine. But Roberts didn't really endear himself to some of the liberals on the court, particularly Hugo Black. And so when Roberts retired, and Roberts and Frankfurter loathed Roberts, loved Roberts initially, loathed him when he was striking down all of Roosevelt's New Deal programs, and then became very close to Owen Roberts once Frankfurter joined the court in 1939. And when Roberts retires, it was customary for all the justices on the court to send him a letter signed by all the justices congratulating him on his retirement. And Harlan Fistone was the Chief Justice, and he writes this letter, and he sends it around, not to the entire court, but some of the justices. And Frankfurter saw the original letter, but Hugo Black objected to some of the sentences in the letter, one of which was that fidelity to principle was Roberts's guide. And Hugo Black insisted that Harlan Fistone take out these two sentences. And Frankfurter and Robert Jackson were really apoplectic that Hugo Black would be so petty as to try to take out anything complimentary about Owen Roberts in this letter. And then so there's back and forth, and the justices meet at conference about this, and neither Hugo Black and his allies will budge, and Frankfurter and Jackson, they won't budge. Jackson is over in Europe at this point with the war crimes prosecutions that result in the convictions at Nuremberg. So he's not even there firsthand for some of this. And what ends up happening is that Harlan Fistone ends up reading the letter on the first day of the Supreme Court's term, reading the letter with the sentences deleted from it that Hugo Black had wanted deleted, as if it were on behalf of the entire court. And after they got off the bench, Frankfurter was incensed that Harlan Fistone would do this, because Frankfurter had not voted for Stone to send that letter, much less read it in open court. And so it created another huge brouhaha. It showed, how much Harlan Fistone had lost control of this court.
What was the relationship between Felix Frankfurter and William O. Douglas?
I mean, the short answer is when they were on the court, they were bitter enemies after being allies, and as young New Dealers in the mid to late 1930s. But they really just came to loathe each other while they were on the court. Douglas resented Frankfurter's kind of pedantic professorial speeches at the justices' private conferences, and Frankfurter really resented what he thought were Douglas's presidential aspirations. Douglas aspired to succeed Franklin Roosevelt as president, and Frankfurter thought that this was often compromising Douglas's votes while he was on the court.
You say in your book, you talk about a lot of things that are familiar: Sacco and Vanzetti, judicial restraint, Alger Hiss, Zionism. I can go on. But you also tell some interesting stories about a man named Sylvester Gates, which is not about the law so much, but played a role in both Frankfurter's life and in Gates's life.
Yeah, Sylvester Gates was had come over on a fellowship to Harvard Law School. And the reason why he came over on that fellowship to Harvard Law School, he was from Britain. He was a barrister, and he wanted to study with Felix Frankfurter. And so Frankfurter, who's a huge Anglophile, right? He loved all things Britain. He said, of course. Well, Sylvester Gates turned out to be a very talented graduate student, a very talented writer, and it was Gates who was collaborating with Frankfurter on his initial article about this case of Sacco and Vanzetti, who were two Italian anarchists who were accused of robbery and murder of a shoe factory payroll, and the paymaster and the person who was with the paymaster. They were accused of murder and convicted, and the appeals went on for years and years. For a long time, Frankfurter wasn't interested in the case, but then some things came out about the prosecution of the case and the trial judge's conduct in the case, where Frankfurter read the record and he was outraged, and he felt like that Sacco and Vanzetti were convicted because they were Italian immigrants and because they were anarchists, and not necessarily based on the evidence. And so Sylvester Gates became Frankfurter's co-author in his book, a silent co-author, unattributed co-author on Sacco and Vanzetti. And Frankfurter thought so highly of Sylvester Gates that he was prodding Sylvester Gates to be Oliver Wendell Holmes' secretary, which was the word in those days for a law clerk. And Frankfurter was in charge of choosing out Oliver Wendell Holmes' secretaries. And Gates said no, and he went back to England, and he started a career, but first as a lawyer and then as a banker. And then during the bombing of Britain in 1940, Gates, and he had been in constant contact with Frankfurter over the years because Frankfurter made a lot of trips to Britain. Gates in 1940, during the bombing of Britain, asked Frankfurter if Felix and Marion Frankfurter were childless, even though Felix loved children. Gates said, "Hey, will you take in our 3 British children?" during the bombing of Britain, and Felix immediately wires back, "Yes." So Frankfurter asks, "Can we take in your children?" And Gates, who's super anguished about this, says yes. They ship them out on a plane to America, and for several years, their 3 young children are living with the Frankfurters, and the youngest of those children, Oliver, really captures the imagination of Felix and Marion Frankfurter. And one of the things for me that was remarkable in this book was I got to go visit with Oliver Gates. I got to stay at his house. I got to see all of his family's correspondence with Felix and Marion Frankfurter. And I learned, sadly, that Oliver Gates, who was Sylvester's youngest son, passed away of cancer in June. But it was one of the great things about this book that I was able to talk with Oliver Gates, hear about Felix from Oliver Gates, correspond with Oliver Gates. And if you think about it, part of Frankfurter's overheated Americanism or patriotism or strong feelings about World War II had something to do with these three British children who were living in his home.
By the way, where did Oliver Gates live?
Where did he live? In Britain?
Did he go back to Britain?
He went back to Britain, right? So he spent a year at Harvard Law School. It was the year that he helped co-write this book on Sacco and Vanzetti with Frankfurter. Then he immediately went back to Britain rather than clerk for Oliver Wendell Holmes. And he ended up, spending a long period of time working both as a barrister, as a banker, and then during World War II was working for the British government.
Back to Sacco and Vanzetti for a moment. In the end, they were found guilty, but in the end, what happened to the two of them?
Well, in the end, they were executed in 1927. So while appeal was pending before the Massachusetts Supreme Court, Frankfurter publishes this book about the case. And his idea for the book was to kind of distill the trial transcript so anyone, who lawyers and non-lawyers could make up their own mind about whether or not Sacco and Vanzetti had received a fair trial. And Frankfurter's conclusion was that they had not received a fair trial. And what ends up happening, Brian, is that Felix becomes the accused, right? All of Boston's elite, what I would call old Boston, right? WASP, or the old, Beacon Hill part of Boston, sort of takes up after Frankfurter as trying to impugn the integrity of the Massachusetts court system, to impugn or pressure the Supreme Judicial Court of Massachusetts. And so it's almost as if Frankfurter is on trial. The Massachusetts State Police wiretap Frankfurter's home, both in Cambridge and in Duxbury, where he's spending the summer of 1927. And there's several dramatic last-minute pleas to Oliver Wendell Holmes and Louis Brandeis and Harlan Fiske Stone at their summer homes to try to get them to stay Sacco and Vanzetti's execution. Frankfurter stays well out of this part. He's working behind the scenes the whole time, but he's staying well out of all of the legal maneuvers that are happening. But what ends up happening is Holmes and Brandeis and Stone say, look, we don't think that their constitutional rights were violated at such a level that we should interfere with the Massachusetts court system, and they get executed. It's a shattering moment for Frankfurter and his wife Marion, who are super invested in their case, and Frankfurter is a lifelong opponent of capital punishment. He thought that the Rosenberg's trial, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, had also received an unfair trial and was adamant that the court should hear their case, and wrote some really passionate dissents about the Rosenberg case. So this Sacco and Vanzetti case had a huge impact on his worldview. That said, he was not angry with Holmes or Brandeis and Stone for not interfering. He thought that the people who should have stepped in and saved Sacco and Vanzetti were the Supreme Judicial Court of Massachusetts or the governor of Massachusetts. And he thought that the governor, with his power of either some sort of clemency to life imprisonment or even a pardon, should have stepped in, and the governor did not.
Along the way, I kept thinking when I was reading the book that there's a similarity, not political similarity, but similarity to Justice Scalia on things like judicial restraint. And I kept trying to figure out for sure. I know you say that he was not a member of a party, meaning Felix Frankfurter. What would have been first of all, is there any similarity at all to Scalia? And then secondly, what would be his party politics if he were alive today?
Let me start with the first question because it's a little bit easier. You're not the first person to make the similarity to Scalia. I think they're similar in that they had strong judicial philosophies. They were just different judicial philosophies, but they had strong judicial philosophies, and they were passionate about those philosophies. For Scalia, it was textualism when it came to federal laws, and originalism when it came to the Constitution. And for Frankfurter, it was this idea of judicial restraint, this idea that we should allow the elected branches to make policy in this country and by and large defer, and that most federal laws were constitutional because he believed that the federal powers were quite capacious, that they were broadly defined, and that the federal government had a lot of not just express power but also implied power. And so Frankfurter, when it came to federal laws, was willing to uphold almost every federal law. So there's certain similarities there. They're also similar in that they weren't coalition builders and that they tended to alienate people who could have been allies for them. And they were also incredibly active at oral argument, right, where they would interrupt questioners and ask many questions and kind of dominate an oral argument. So I think there are a lot of similarities between them. They're also were incredibly charismatic and sort of live wires. There's that. But their philosophies were very different. The second thing is what would his party politics be? He certainly wouldn't be happy with the turn the current Republican Party has taken, the kind of anti-democratic, authoritarian turn, because I think Frankfurter really believed in kind of small d democracy. So he would have been in favor of whatever party was most promoting the ideas of kind of a small d democracy. So I imagine he would have supported, the current Democratic Party president, but Frankfurter was somebody who just wasn't really interested in party. He was more interested in ideas, which was why he supported Robert La Follette, a third-party candidate for president in 1924, and why he supported both Republican and Democratic nominees. And it was really just a different time because you had liberals in both parties. But he just wasn't really a party guy. He was much more somebody who believed in ideas and who believed in leaders.
Why did he vote for Eugene Debs, a socialist?
That shocked me, Brian. I think he was so this was in 1920. He cast a protest vote for Eugene Debs, even though Frankfurter was a capitalist through and through. He thought the candidacies of both Harding for the Republican Party and Cox for the Democratic Party, that they were both such bad candidates that he couldn't just hold his nose and vote for either one. That's what I mean by he just wasn't a committed Democrat or Republican. And so he voted for Eugene Debs. That really shocked me when I learned that.
I want to ask you about your book, and this is not meant to be critical, but I do want to ask you, why did you write a 700-page book? It's big, it's heavy, small print. Explain all that, because I'm sure you thought it through.
I thought it through, and Frankfurter lived a long time, and he was in public life a very long time, from his 20s into his 80s. And as I said, I really organized it around presidents and not around, particular judicial decisions. And when you have an impact on presidencies from Taft to LBJ, that requires a lot of time and a lot of space. And he was one of the most influential political figures of the 20th century. I thought he earned every one of those 700 pages, and I always asked myself as I was writing it, am I boring the reader? Is this boring? And I just tried to cut out anything that was boring, but I didn't want to. I wanted to make sure I gave a complete picture of what he was up to on and off the bench.
How is it possible that 1,000 pages have been stolen from the Library of Congress from his papers?
Well, it's possible because it happened in the early 70s, before there were cameras in the Library of Congress manuscript divisions, right? There were simply just logbooks that logged out when people were checking out boxes or looking at different boxes. So somebody who was very skilled and had a real knowledge of history started taking select documents out of the room, and there wasn't a lot of good security in there at the time. There is now, There's much better security. There's cameras everywhere in that room. What's amazing is that we got some of them back. We got them back because of a public plea by an influential newspaper columnist, right? And when Jack Anderson makes a plea in the Washington Post for who's ever stolen the Frankfurter papers and gives them back, somebody gave Jack Anderson's leg man a huge sheaf of documents back, but we did not get them all back. And many things that are missing are really important diaries. We're missing the diary, Felix's diary from 1927, which was during the Sacco and Vanzetti case, and we're missing Felix's diary from 1937, which was the New Deal constitutional crisis when Roosevelt proposed to add 6 more justices to the court. And that's a loss, not just for me as a biographer, but for all historians who are interested in American history. I hope we get them back, Brian. I hope somebody's listening today that can help us get them back.
You and I last talked in 2017, and I would suggest to people that are interested in this subject that you can go on C-SPAN's archives and see the Q&A program, which would be called Brad Snyder and House of Truth. We talked in that hour about Felix Frankfurter some, and when did you lock on to the idea of doing this book on him?
I don't know. I just called me. I mean, I got really interested in Felix Frankfurter. I may have told you this in 2017 when I read his dissent in the Rosenberg case. And people who were interested in the Supreme Court, sort of clerks and people in government, were really disillusioned with the way the Supreme Court had handled that case. And he told people in that case, he said in his dissent, he published his dissent after the Rosenbergs had been executed. And he justified doing so. He said, history has its claims. He was trying to tell his former law clerks and people who regularly argued in front of the Supreme Court not to lose faith in the judicial process, not to lose faith in the Supreme Court of the United States. And I read that dissent on the heels of the Supreme Court's decision in Bush versus Gore, which I thought was bad for the Supreme Court as an institution and bad for the country, that they should have let the political process play out. And I was disillusioned with the court after Bush versus Gore. And so that dissent really spoke to me. And I thought I need to learn more about Felix Frankfurter. And ever since then, it was just something that I felt compelled to do it. I couldn't believe there wasn't a good full-length biography of Felix Frankfurter. And I just became compelled to do it and to read the thousands and thousands of letters that he wrote that are out there and gather them up all over the world. And it was really fun.
You were moving from the University of Wisconsin to Georgetown Law School, which is not far from our offices here. Why did you make that move, and how has it changed your life?
Well, first of all, this biography wouldn't have been possible without the support of my deans and colleagues at the University of Wisconsin. I love teaching there, but I'm from the Washington, D.C. area, for starters. I grew up in the Maryland suburbs. But the main thing is, for me as a legal historian, to be blocks away from the Library of Congress and its manuscript division, which is one of the most incredible archives of people's papers throughout American history. So for a historian like me to be just blocks away from here is just great for me and my work. And of course, Georgetown is an incredible law school, and they've gave me some incredible support, both financially and in terms of getting some time off to complete this book. But I would just urge anyone, if you haven't been to the Library of Congress, if you haven't been to the Library of Congress Manuscript Division, and you live in Washington, you should go. You could look up anyone's papers that you're interested in. The finding aids are on the web. It's just an amazing public resource.
We have a little more audio. You probably have seen this. Paul Freund, who you write about, interviewed Felix Frankfurter and a number of years ago. I don't have the date on it, but it doesn't really matter so much as listening to let me just see here. It was early 60s, when they had this interview. He was asked about reading, and let's just listen to a little bit of this and get your reaction to it.
Most of our experience is vicarious, even with the greatest breadth of personal experience. it's infinitesimal compared with the accumulated experience of mankind. And the accumulated experience of mankind is predominantly contained within the covers of books. And therefore, I quite agree with you that biographies of not only of lawyers, but of public men in the neighboring territory of law, of historians. Our law is so much compounded of history and economics and sociology. And I do not lay aside the more imaginative flowerings of the human mind, namely poetry.
It's not much, and it's got some audio problems with it, but you could hear him talking about books. What's your reaction?
Well, my reaction is one of my favorite stories about him was he was in a bookstore in Boston, and he saw somebody else in the bookstore, and he started striking up a conversation with that person, and they talked. The bookstore was closing, and they ended up talking for like an hour outside the bookstore, and the person he was talking to in the bookstore was, and he didn't, I don't think knew it initially, was the poet Robert Frost. And as a result of that conversation, they became really good friends. Frankfurter was just a voracious reader of all kinds of things, but he particularly loved reading about history. He was incredibly interested in Abraham Lincoln and read everything he could get his hands on about Lincoln. He looked at the original folios of Thomas Jefferson's papers in the archives at the Library of Congress for a speech that he gave about Jefferson when the Jefferson Memorial was being dedicated. And so, Frankfurter just loved reading. He devoured newspapers just on a daily basis. 6, 7, American ones, British ones. His law clerks, he was constantly discussing the news of the day and things in various books that he had read with his law clerks. It would have been fun to be a fly on the wall in his chambers, given how much he read.
Give us a minute on the House of Truth, just so people could know what you did in that book we talked about in 2017.
Sure, Brian. The House of Truth was a political salon that started with a lot of people in the Taft administration during the teens. And what united with them was that even though they were in the Taft administration, they thought Taft was a horrible president, and they thought that the way to create an industrial democracy in America, which meant having labor unions have a seat at the table with management, was to reelect Theodore Roosevelt president. And so around this idea of reelecting Roosevelt and creating an industrial democracy, these young men lived together in DuPont Circle, just north of the Circle in Washington, and they would invite a who's who over to dinner, from Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. to Louis Brandeis to Herbert Hoover when he was working, during World War I. Anybody who was anyone would come through that house for dinner, and people who lived in that house included young journalist Walter Lippmann, who became close friends with Frankfurter. So it was a lively place, and there were a lot. And the New Republic was founded by people who came through that house. It was a lively place and a big source of ideas. And Oliver Wendell Holmes, even though it really revived Holmes kind of intellectually, associated with the young people in that house.
You say that his wife Marion wasn't liked by everybody. Why? Well,
Marion is a really neat person, but she had a lot of health problems. Some people thought that they were, and some of them were quite real, right? She had rheumatoid arthritis and was getting treatment at the time by a doctor who believed that you could treat rheumatoid arthritis with antibiotics, which turned out to be, completely disproven. So she had a crippling rheumatoid arthritis, but people thought that she was a bit of a hypochondriac and very self-centered, but she was also very learned, very well-read. She captivated people in Britain when the Frankfurters spent a year there on a fellowship at Oxford and became very good friends with the philosopher Isaiah Berlin. So she could be intellectual and charming. People like Joseph Alsop thought she was incredibly charming, but other people, such as Dean Acheson, thought that she was incredibly difficult and self-centered and really just thought about herself. And after a while with rheumatoid arthritis, she became kind of self-invalided. And what I mean by that is I think she could have come out of her house, but she just chose not to at a certain point. So she spent most of the later part of her life just in her bedroom. And Felix brought all of her meals to her in her bedroom.
A couple of things before we close out. The Lowell story, President Lowell of Harvard, and his relationship with Frankfurter.
Frankfurter hated A. Lawrence Lowell. He thought correctly that he thought Lowell was deeply, deeply anti-Semitic. Lowell in the early 1920s had proposed a 15% quota on Jewish undergraduates at Harvard and established a committee to study the issue and left Frankfurter, the first Jewish professor at the law school and one of the more prominent Jewish professors, off the committee. And Frankfurter went kind of nuts about the whole thing and fought tooth and nail against this 15% quota. Harvard didn't establish the quota, but instead established a kind of geographic diversity to try to achieve the same result and reduce the number of Jewish students at Harvard. And then in 1927, the governor, when he's considering what to do of Massachusetts, what to do about the case of Sacco and Vanzetti, appoints a 3-person committee to study the case. And who does he appoint to chair the committee? He appoints A. Lawrence Lowell. And Lowell, Frankfurter initially had some hope that there was no way that Lowell could possibly recommend that the governor not deny them some clemency, at least, or commute their sentences to life imprisonment. But Lowell was very dismissive of anything that would undermine the trial and anything that supported the notion that they had an unfair trial. And he wrote a report recommending to the governor to deny clemency or to deny commuting their sentences. And Frankfurter was sort of outraged all over again and helped attack the Lowell in his report in the pages of the New York Times and other newspapers.
How was it that when he was nominated and then confirmed that he ended up being the first justice to appear in a public hearing to get confirmed?
Well, I mean, he is the first justice to appear in a public hearing on sort of kind of a wide-ranging basis. So I'll just say that Harlan Fistone in 1925 appeared, but only to answer questions about what he had done as Attorney General for Calvin Coolidge. Right, so on a specific question, Frankfurter was the first Supreme Court nominee to appear, and reluctantly, right? But there was a lot of anti-Semitism. There was an anti-communist hysteria, and this kind of anti-Semitism and anti-communist hysteria sort of joined forces. And there was a horrible senator from Nevada, Senator Pat McCarran, who was sort of a proto-Joe McCarthy, who had it out for Frankfurter and wanted to expose him as a communist, or at least as associating with communists. So Frankfurter testified in this gigantic Senate caucus room. The newsreels captured this testimony, and there were tons of photographers, and it was a packed house in the Senate caucus room. It was a really big deal, and there were a lot of really kooky people who tried to smear Frankfurter as a communist, but they weren't real successful during those hearings.
By the way, I want to give credit on that last audio clip to the Historical and Special Collections at Harvard Law School. But while I'm saying the word Harvard, I want to ask you about and I'm not an expert on this, so I got to be careful, but Harvard has implied that there should be a 15% quota on Asian students.
Well, I mean, today?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a court case.
Well, there's currently a case before the Supreme Court of the United States about whether Harvard's admissions policy is discriminating against Asian students, right? I don't think there's a quota, but I think there's been a lot of discovery that has produced some evidence that suggests that Harvard was discriminating against Asian students, and that case is currently before the Supreme Court of the United States. I do want to go back to the Harvard Law School Special Collections. In the Harvard Law School Library, they have a treasure trove of things about both, not just Felix Frankfurter, but also Oliver Wendell Holmes and also Louis Brandeis, and they were incredibly helpful to me in helping me get photographs for this book. They have a wonderful collection of photographs, and just I spent hours and hours there. It's just a wonderful group of people who work there.
I want to go back to the Asian situation and the Jewish situation with the 15% quota. What is a great liberal college like Harvard doing, wanting to even come close to setting quotas on anything?
Well, let's just talk about the 1920s because I'm more familiar with it. I just think Harvard Law School wasn't the liberal progressive place that it was today, and you know, A. Lawrence Lowell was just sort of a racist, reactionary person and deeply anti-Semitic, and he thought there were too many Jews on campus, and that bothered him, and so he wanted to limit the number of Jews who were coming to Harvard. And I just think admissions then were different. It wasn't the kind of selective admissions process then that it is now. And I think now you have a highly selective admissions process. It's incredibly hard to get into these schools, whether it's Harvard or Yale. And I think that opponents of affirmative action have pointed to kind of the way that schools like Harvard choose their applicants, and specifically the way Harvard chooses people to admit, and have uncovered some evidence that they've been discriminating against Asian Americans in the process. And of course, if you want to ask me, Felix Frankfurter would be outraged by that, right? Because he thought that Harvard Law School, even though it did not admit women at the time, so it wasn't a total meritocracy, but he thought, from his perspective, that Harvard Law School was the ultimate meritocracy, because whether you stayed there depended on the grades you got in your first year of law school. And in Frankfurter's day, 30 to 40% of the class flunked out, on grades alone. And so he thought it was the ultimate meritocracy. And so any sort of quota or discrimination against whether it's black applicants or Jewish applicants or Asian applicants would have outraged him.
Let's go to the close of your book and the epilogue as we wrap this up, and explain what happened when he died and what the memorial service was like and who was there.
Yeah, so the Frankfurter's memorial service when he died was a very small invitation-only affair in his apartment, and Frankfurter was not a practicing Jewish person, but he had given up going to synagogue when he was in his teens. But he asked one of his former law clerks, Lou Henkin, who was the son of an Orthodox rabbi, to say the Jewish mourner's Kaddish, which is what is traditionally said for Jews when they're buried, at his funeral. And he asked Paul Freund, whom he was talking to in the audio clip that you played earlier, who was one of his most beloved former students and was a professor at Harvard Law School, to give the eulogy. And they did. And Lyndon Johnson was there. 8 of the 9 justices, or I should say 7 of the 8 justices, or maybe 8 of the 9, because there were 9 justices that were there, except for William O. Douglas, who didn't show up. And I'm not blaming him. I think Douglas thought it would have been hypocritical for him to show up at Frankfurter's funeral. And it was a big deal for a sitting president to show up at somebody's apartment for the funeral. And in my book, there's a photo of Lyndon Johnson leaving Frankfurter's apartment with what I described as a real hangdog look on his face. And they played music. Frankfurter was a lover of classical music. And they played a quintet by Mozart at the funeral that Frankfurter wanted played there, and they actually had a live string quartet there. So, in many ways, it was exactly the type of affair that Frankfurter would have wanted. Paul Freund concluded his eulogy with some lines from John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress that Frankfurter had read at Brandeis's funeral in Brandeis's apartment back in 1943. So there was a certain symmetry there between the first Jewish justice's funeral and the third Jewish justice who had spent so many long years together.
Have you decided what your next book's going to be?
I have, Brian. I'm working on a book on a black communist named Angelo Herndon, who was organizing unemployed white and black workers during the Great Depression in Atlanta, and he was charged with attempting to incite insurrection, which was a capital crime, even though it was a peaceful protest. And he was sentenced to 18 to 20 years on a Georgia chain gang, and that case twice goes up to the Supreme Court of the United States, and a huge cast of characters get behind Angelo Herndon, whose case is a cause célèbre like that of the Scottsboro Boys. And the second time the case goes up to the Supreme Court by a 5-4 decision, Owen Roberts writes that Angelo Herndon's rights to free speech and assembly were violated and overturns the conviction. But other than that, you'll have to stay tuned until the next book. I hope we get the opportunity to talk about it a few years from now.
Brad Snyder can be found at Georgetown Law School teaching, and his new book is called Democratic Justice, Felix Frankfurter, the Supreme Court, and the Making of the Liberal Establishment. Felix Frankfurter died in 1965 at age 82. Brad Snyder, thank you very much.
Brian, thanks so much for having me. It's always so much fun talking to you.
Thanks for listening to the Booknotes Plus podcast. Please rate and review Booknotes Plus, and don't forget to follow so you never miss an episode. Questions or comments, we would love to hear from you. You can email us at podcasts@c-span.org.